Welcome, everyone, to the PERVADE conversation with Dr. Libby Hemphill. I'm Katie Shilton. I'm the principal investigator of the PERVADE project. And the PERVADE project is a 6-institution research project focusing on answering empirical questions in data ethics. We're funded by the US National Science Foundation, and we're studying how people react to their pervasive digital data being used in research, how data scientists are grappling with ethical questions in their work, and how regulators such as university IRBs, institutional review boards, are guiding data-intensive research. And this series is meant to highlight a number of researchers doing cutting-edge work in data science and data ethics. And today I'm joined by Dr. Libby Hemphill, who is an associate professor at the University of Michigan School of Information, and is also the director of the Social Media Archive at ICPSR. She collects, studies, and archives social media data. And when studying social media data, she focuses on content moderation and online toxicity. And when she's archiving social data, so she studies it and she archives it, which is part of what we're here to talk about today, she works to create equitable, ethical, and accessible data resources for social media researchers. We are going to take questions and answer questions through the Q&A function throughout the webinar. So feel free to make this a conversation and ask your questions in the Q&A. I'll be watching out for them, and I'll say a few reminders throughout too that people can post in the Q&A. I also have lots of questions for Libby today. So Libby, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I am excited to be here. Happy summer, participants. I see you in the list.
So we wanted to talk to you today because you are both a researcher who uses social media data and you are an archivist of social media data. And with that hat on, you're thinking a lot about the responsibilities that institutions and repositories have to digital data ethics. So to get started, I wondered if you'd tell us more about your work at ICPSR, archiving social media data.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So there are some tensions when you're a researcher and an archivist, because one of the professional ethics in archives is to not prevent others from benefiting from the stuff that's in the archive. So I have to be careful about meeting not just my data goals, but others' data goals in the development of a resource. And I started thinking about how could we build a sort of large, equitable, accessible, and I'll talk about what I mean by equitable and accessible in a second, archive of social media data that would allow for more diversity of skills and preparation among folks who access and analyze the data. So folks on the call probably know that getting social media data isn't actually all that hard. The challenges come in how do you make inferences about it? How do you make decisions about when and how it's okay to be used, especially given that it's just kind of out there waiting for us to pick it up. And so what we've been trying to do with the social media archive is to bring some sort of structure and opportunity and services around social media data so that we can start to develop norms around its collection, use, preservation, and access that are in keeping with the goals that people have in doing research, but also that protect the interests of those who are represented in the data. And a couple of things that means for us is that we enter this project remembering that the people represented in social media data don't actually owe researchers anything. Yes, their data is available to us. That doesn't mean it is for us. And that has been one of the tensions in creating the archive. And yeah, our goal is to sort of build a broad data resource. And something that I said to Katie in our little practice session was that it matters to me that what we're building is an archive, which is not just a GitHub list, repos list of files, but rather services for people and guidelines about ethical use and sort of advocacy within platforms and to legislators about policies that ought to govern these kinds of things. Those are all normal activities for archives. We just haven't really seen it yet around social media data because there just aren't that many big data archives.
Fantastic. So let's start with your point, your really good point that like this users don't owe us this data, right? Like the people documented this data, it wasn't for research necessarily. Do you think users are aware of the research uses and things like archiving of social media data? And what might we do to increase that awareness or their sort of consciousness of the fact that this data is has a lot of uses. It might live on in an archive.
Yeah, I don't think that people are aware, and I'm basing that on other prior work in this area, sort of surveying folks, including some of your work and others on the PERVADE team, that we know that users, even when they think of a piece of content that is public legally, meaning that they agreed to the terms of service of the platform and that you and I could see it even if we don't know them, they don't actually think about that content as public in audience. So Alice Marwick has some early work from a long time ago about, well, a long time ago in social media research, about this as well, that sort of an imagined audience and a real audience and a legal audience are not the same, and there's some overlap there. But your point that we ought to do some education is actually one of the reasons that we need something like an archive instead of just a bunch of researchers. So I think that one way that we can learn to do this as researchers who use social media data is to look to researchers who use personal health information, that they've already done a lot of work to understand how do people understand research and what research means, and how do people understand what it means for them to take small personal risks that have in aggregate large potential social gains, and that instead of thinking of ourselves as the first on the scene, we should think of ourselves as another type of research that is conducted with sensitive data about individuals. And when we do that, we can learn to do things like host webinars where we explain to people what is the benefit of using their individual data in concert with everybody else's individual data to understand something about a social phenomenon. One of the challenges for us will be that sometimes social media researchers don't actually have a compelling social reason to do the work. And I would say maybe don't do it then, which if you're just like, you know what, this data is kind of interesting and I want to use it to understand something because it's available to me, that might not be good enough to justify the individual risks that users in that data are taking. And that's a pretty big posture change for us to take as researchers who use social media data. So one of them is like, think differently about what research you actually do and think about whether or not the social benefit of that new knowledge outweighs the individual risks that you're requiring people in your data set to take. And that was one of the big differences between what we do and what public health or sort of medical research do, that it's easier for them to articulate a public benefit to these private risks. And, you know, one would be that actually many of the risks that we're asking people who are represented in social media data to take are really small. And so it might be okay to say, like, I know you're mad, but we just learned how misinformation spreads. And so you're just going to have to stay mad at me. And that might be okay. Like, that's what happens when data is public. But if you're like, oh, I know that you just got fired because I exposed you as, I don't know, something that your boss didn't like on the internet, and we don't have great worker protections in the US, and so you got fired, you better have a pretty compelling social benefit to that research, that where the risk is someone could get fired.
So that raises the question of who determines what research has a big enough social benefit or what risks are small enough. Traditionally, that has been something that IRBs have sort of done, although not really, right? They're not looking at social benefit.
That's a lot to put on an IRB.
Yeah, it's a lot, and it's a lot to put on IRBs. And I think that that's not, they're supposed to be determining if the risks are appropriate, right? That is something that IRBs traditionally have done. They are not really supposed to be determining if the social benefit of the research is enough to justify it. So who would do that? I suggest maybe a peer review process of some sort before the research is done. I mean, is it you? Maybe you get to decide. I don't know. Like, who gets to decide?
I don't think it's me. Let's be clear. I don't think it's me. But I might be part of it because I'm a member of this group of researchers. So I do think that it's going to take some sort of community norm to do that governance. But I think that part of why IRBs are not the right body is that there are lots of researchers who use social media data who sidestep IRBs anyway, that they don't think that they apply to them. And the new common rule guidelines make it look like a lot of what I do doesn't actually count as human subjects research under the IRB and HHS rules either. And that makes me a little bit nervous because I'm like, I'm pretty sure that you want to know that I've thought about the risks and benefits here. I actually think that if we were, so there are a couple of things that we could do. One of them is pre-registration. So, you know, you register your study and then sort of that gets peer reviewed instead of the outcome. I think that has a lot of benefits besides sort of ethical data practices, because I think We put a lot of things in file drawers that would be really helpful for us as society to know. So I like the idea of pre-registering studies and then publishing the results, even if they are at no result or a negative or something. So that's one thing that we could do, is sort of review the process. We could also, I think, just require people to be reflective. So for instance, when you submit a paper for publication, you have to indicate that you've thought about the risks and benefits. That would, I think, solve for some of the worst accidental infringements. That I don't think that researchers are out to get the people represented in the data. Even as a person who studies white supremacists, like, my goal is not to expose individual white supremacists and to shame them. It's to understand the phenomenon of extremism. And I think that that's mostly true for researchers. Like, people are not generally trying to out individuals, but we may do it by accident. And the way that we prevent accidents is through reflection. And so we have to ask people to do these types of reflection. And right now the currency is paper. And so there's got to be a way to tie it to that currency. But one challenge there, I mean, there are many, but one is that preprints are increasingly currency also. And nobody at archive.org is going to make you reflect on whether or not you actually thought through the risks and benefits for individuals and for society before you publish your paper on archive or even social archive or in your institutional repository. So some of this is going to have to come from peer pressure, which is one part of peer review, but more than peer pressure also. I think one of the other reasons that data like this ought to be going through something like an archive is that the privacy protections and the risk mitigation doesn't always have to happen on data ingest, that it's possible for us to do some of that protection on data disclosure and to evaluate risks on output rather than risks on input of the data. And without a mechanism like an archive, there isn't really a way to do that is reliable. So I think there's some options in that answer, but peer pressure is the bottom line.
Yeah. So an archive provides institutional scaffolding to do both some protections on input as needed, as well as evaluate potential risks on disclosure. You can see the whole pipeline, essentially, right? The research pipeline. You also could be a place for pre-registration to live, or
and just to plug ICPSR, we do have all those pieces. We have a place for pre-registration to live. We have a variety of secure data enclaves where the data stays in place and the compute comes to the data to reduce both accidental risk and, accidental leak and breach. And we do output review, like before stuff leaves the enclave, it gets reviewed by people who are not part of the research project and don't have any stake in whether or not it gets published or not published, to see what is the level of risk that is carried by the people represented in the data. And then they talk to the authors about the relationship between that risk and the output.
So that's another thing I want to dig into, is that I think it's useful in this space to have sort of analogs to other kinds of data and other kinds of data protection that we know how to do, that we've been doing for a long time, right? And ICPSR has been doing this kind of thing. What are some of the, like, what do you see as the best analogies for social media data in the data archiving world?
So I think health information is one, because everybody can sort of understand that they have some parts of their health record that are sensitive to them and some that are not, and that people sort of readily understand that different data might be of interest to different people at different times, and they might be willing to share different data at different times under different levels of obscurity. Like, maybe it's fine that you know that I used to, I don't know, what is something that I used to do? I used to ride a bicycle without a helmet. Like, that's part of my health record. You could put that in there. And now I do. And look, we can study behavior change as we learned about the protection of helmets. So public health is one. If you want to go really far into data protection, you can go to something like microdata from the census. So in order to use microdata from the US Census, well, let's talk about the Canadian Census, actually, because their data protection is even more aggressive. You have to physically take your body to a room and use the data in that room. You can't take your stuff in and you can't take anything out. You do your analysis in the room, and then you send your output to be vetted by a staffer. And then when they've approved your output, you get it back. And that is a way that we deal with microdata, because that data is quite sensitive and people don't get to make really fine-tuned control over who can access that data under what conditions and for what purposes. Those get reviewed as well. And so I think that those are sort of two what do we call them, regimes maybe for protected or sensitive data that have different types of access protections. I think that in the US, they're called RDCs, Research Data Centers for the Census. We allow for virtual enclave access to that data in the US, but there are places like Canada that still don't even do virtual enclaves. You have to physically go to the room. And I actually am not, and in order to get access to that room, you have to be vetted by the federal government, and they do a background check, and your agreement to use the data is between your institution and the university that has the RDC. So the mechanism for protection are not just shame on the individual researcher, but financial and resource on the institution that the person belongs to. That, you know, platforms have good lawyers. I have pretty great lawyers at U of M. And so we can reach agreements on what are appropriate sort of data sharing and agreement violation mechanisms. If you violate the agreement that you have with the census, you go to jail. So like there are sticks and carrots and gates, and there are lots of different options. But we tend not to think of them when we're talking about social media data because it is at some level available or public. And so we don't think about it as sensitive. But when we start to think about it as sensitive, we get all these different types of resources that institutions like archives and universities bring to provide protection and access.
Yeah, this is so, I think thinking about these kinds of different protections is so useful because so one of the questions I get a lot from sort of social media researchers is, okay, well, what should we do with social, you know, what do we need to do to protect social media data? And I'm like, well, what is your social media data, right? Like, are you looking at, you know, tweets about the weather, or are you looking at documentation of self-harm among you know, teenagers? Like those are two different kinds of data that both are social media data, and like one of those needs a lot.
But I just want one answer, Katie, and I want it to be whatever I want.
Right. Right. And so I really, yeah, I think this idea that, right, that there are various kinds of protections for various kinds of data, and social media data is not all one thing, but is instead many kinds of data. Some of it is like microdata from the census, and some of it is like public health data, and some of it is like the news, right? You know, and like those are all different. Yeah.
And when we're thinking about like data publics, some of it is like what would happen if I sat outside and I watched an intersection for a week. That like that's a type of research that people are allowed to do without letting every person who walks by know about it, right? But I don't then get to go infer their political affiliation and their address after I watch them walk by, which is
right. Some social media data is like Lloyd Humphrey's tea room, you know, which was a 60s era research, right? Which was done on male-male sexual relations, where the researcher disguised himself and his intention and went into bathhouses and then identified the participants with their license plates, right? So that license plate data tracing was a part of it, and that was just, you know, old-fashioned sociological research that was highly controversial. And but it had this really big data feel to it, right? So like one of the things that we've been saying at PERVADE is that there's a lot of social media data. It's a lot like ethnography, actually, right? Like it has that feel of sort of invasion of a space, invasion, and you have to think in the same ways about, like, you know, who has power in this situation. You know, what can you trace out of that setting to, for instance, identify people or things like that. So yeah, that right. But it also could be just like hanging out on a street corner, which would be fairly uncontroversial. So yeah, trying to make those distinctions for various kinds of data.
I think there's another type of data that I want us to think about that we often don't in social media research, because we tend to think about what's happening right this minute in social media. But in archives, we have a much longer version of now. And so diaries and other types of sort of personal records are another example of how social media data is kind of like that. Yes. And it might be that these are, you know, that you've gone into, I don't even know now how long Twitter's been around, but at least 15 years. So you just, you know, if you could go back 15 years ago and just grab some information from public Twitter, that's a lot like happening upon a set of diaries. And the risks that individual people are exposed to when they are much, much older or in a different place, when they are deceased, are different than living, breathing, working humans. And that can be different too, but often when we're thinking about social media data, we're like, well, what's happening this second? And then as soon as you've collected it, it's old and out of date. But for lots of types of social and historical research, we don't need this minute. We might actually be better served and do better science if we looked at older or longitudinal data. And then we start to get into histories rather than other types of quantitative study.
And again, the analog is, archivists have been grappling with the ethics of revealing diaries for the 100 years, right?
Turns out we have some expertise.
Yes. So there's a growing national interest right now, including several proposed bills in Congress, in providing researchers with access to social media data in a more structured way than is currently possible. And this particularly would be access to things that are hard for researchers to access now, like Facebook data, right? So Twitter, that's the other thing. Social media data is not all the same in terms of researcher accessibility, right? Like tweets are easy to get. Facebook posts are almost impossible.
Well, tweets from the last 2 weeks are easy to get.
Right. Good. Thank you. Exactly. There's distinctions even within the platform.
A particular hashtag are easy to get, but other different ways that you might want to search or different timeframes, less so.
Much harder, right? So on the one hand, access. So this kind of access to such data could, provide rich knowledge on topics like public health. We've been talking about misinformation, and also importantly, transparency into the platforms themselves, right? That's not something that's easy to do right now with the data that is available to researchers, and researchers have run into legal problems when they've tried. And so that's important. It's something worth supporting. But on the other hand, as we keep talking about, it's not clear that the people using social media are signing up to donate their interactions to research. In fact, I would say it's clear that they are not doing that, right? And creating, say, a national archive of all social media data has some very scary possibilities as well. So how do you sort of see, how do we navigate these tensions? Like, what do you see as next steps for national access to social media data?
So first I want to calm fears about a national social media archive. There is no budget available from any collection of actors to make that even remotely feasible. So there will not be one archive for all social media data. It's just too big and too expensive. And I mean, I don't know about you, but well, I'll even look, like whatever this laptop is, it's a new laptop. I think it's got 2 terabytes in the, I have a 2 terabyte drive that I carry around with me everywhere. It's like a tiny sample of my own data. So we used to think about data storage as essentially free. We're like, oh yeah, just throw it on a hard drive on it. When you talk about storing social media data, the physical infrastructure required to store data at the petabyte scale is not going to happen. So it's just not, like, that's not feasible. It's not going to happen. We don't have the energy infrastructure for it. We don't have the physical plant infrastructure for it. We don't have the technology for indexing. Maybe that's like a 30-year problem. Okay, so now that we know that that's not going to happen, what are some things that could happen? In many of the bills that are traveling in the US, and to some extent those that are in Europe as well, are focused on privacy and accountability. So privacy for the people in the data and accountability for platforms. And each of them, so I'm thinking of the GDPR and the Digital Services Act in Europe, and then some collection of acronyms that have data privacy, protection, transparency in the title here in the US. They have a carve out for research, but none of them really tell you what research means or who researchers are or what the responsibilities of researchers would be. And so I think that indicates, given that it's 2 completely different bodies that work in very different ways and have different mechanisms of accountability to their constituents, that suggests to me that we don't yet know the answer. So there aren't competing definitions of researcher. Everybody's just been like, researcher. And so thinking about what do we as society accept as research is a problem that we're going to have to address, that we need to, as a society, not as researchers alone, decide what constitutes research and how do we know that something is research and how do we know that it has some potential value. There are a couple of mechanisms that we can use to get towards that answer now. So one is that the GDPR has been in place long enough that there are some test cases in Europe sort of pushing at what counts as research. So we could have public conversations about those. Another is that in the US, and this is true in other countries as well, but I don't know their systems as well, but we have research organizations that make decisions about spending public dollars. So I'm thinking about the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, DARPA, that I can never remember what the acronym actually stands for, but the National Endowment for the Humanities. Like, there are lots of different bodies that spend money on things that they call research. And we, as a country, have said these things matter to us, and then we've put money behind them. And I think that using some of those existing structures to make some decisions about what is worth doing could be helpful, with the caveat that we haven't done a great job of identifying high risk, high reward research, especially that done by people who haven't already been successful. So we're fundamentally conservative in how we spend our money. And so we ought to be maybe a little bit less conservative. And I say this as a person who has had grant success, but I don't think that I earned all of it, because I think I earned some of it, and then I got more because I had earned some of it already. This sort of Matthew effect is pretty strong in the funding world, and it would be great if we could diversify that a little bit. But then that comes back to this idea that when you're talking about this new data type that has these tremendous computational infrastructure challenges, we need to be able to provide that infrastructure to folks who don't already have it. So researchers at Maryland and researchers at Michigan, like, we have all the compute we need. Somewhere on campus, someone will give it to us. That's not true for everybody in the US, and it's definitely not true outside the US. And some of the greatest challenges that we face to accountability for platforms are actually outside the US and Canada. And so getting data about genocide into the hands of researchers who could understand it is a totally different problem than getting someone at Michigan access to misinformation about the federal elections in 2020, right? They're sort of similar, but the context in which they occur and the resources that are required to actually use the data, if made available, are very different. And we have to change our own attitudes about recognizing the sort of skill and knowledge in other countries in order to be able to do that successfully. So back to the bills in the US. I think that they're rightly concerned with privacy, but I'm not sure that they share a definition of private. Just like there are multiple definitions floating around about public and sort of what does that mean, there are also differences about privacy. And I think, and this is probably because I'm a feminist scholar, that I think they're actually talking about power and not privacy. But who has the power to decide who can have data and when and for what purposes? And that a privacy hammer that just says, no, you may not have it, actually doesn't allow individuals to say, you can have it if you're going to do this with it. And that instead we need to be thinking about, and in these legislative mechanisms, be thinking about how do we give power to users that allows them to exercise agency and control over their data, which is different from protecting their privacy. I also view privacy protection as a little bit paternalistic, and Katie knows me, but some of you, the rest of you don't. I don't like it when people tell me what to do for my own good. And I don't think I'm the only person who feels like that. But I do like to feel empowered, and I like to feel like I get to decide. And so I think it would be better for us to build and require that individuals be able to control what happens to their data, rather than saying, we're going to shut down access for everybody under all except for research carve out, whatever that is. I think that some of the more interesting components of the bills are where they've been figuring out who does this fit under legislatively. That is this an FTC problem? Is it an FCC problem? Is it NSF? Is it a private place? Is it a sort of public hybrid like ICPSR, where we're housed at a public institution, but we're a consortium? Does it require the construction of a new agency? I think that it would be better for the data to live outside the government, because I think surveillance by the state is pretty bad, and I'd rather not be subjected to more of that. But the state is the only place that really has the kinds of financial resources that we're talking about. So I can't, because all the acronyms are basically the same, I can't remember which bill it is, but there's a draft that includes sort of NSF making financial awards and decisions about scientific merit. I think that's a reasonable first attempt, in part because we know many of the limitations of an NSF approach. And so we might be able to sort of design around those. I also think for those of you who are new to US legislation, what bills do is tell agencies that they should make some rules about things. They don't actually set the rules. So it's more like when Congress passes a bill, they essentially delegate to an agency or agencies some regulatory work. So this is at least, I mean, well, what was the Biden executive order? They were going to like figure out what to maybe do in 18 months. So like the timeline in the US is crazy too, that you introduce a bill for discussion, and then it gets discussed for 6 to 12 months if you're lucky, and then it gets into committee for 6 or 12 months, and then it gets voted on maybe 6 or 12 months later. So now we're at 1.5 to 3 years. And then it gets sent, even if it gets passed, then the agency has some amount of time to set rules. And then once they've set the rules, then to put them in place. And then there's a public comment period. Like the laws don't happen fast. And so I think that's something for us to keep in mind also.
I want to touch on something that you mentioned, which is how central power is to questions of ethics and data ethics in this space. It's a theme that PERVADE has kept returning to as well, because it just seems critical to sort of figuring out the puzzle of what data, when, and by whom, right? And so how do you think about power and justice in your archiving work and in your research work, if it's relevant, but your archiving work, and how might we build considerations of power into an infrastructure for social media data?
So I think one way that we start to do it is that we build these infrastructures in places that have some level of public accountability. And that's why I came to Michigan to work at ICPSR, because we have multiple levels of public accountability. Because U of M is a public institution, ICPSR is a consortium that we have over 800 member organizations who choose our governing council. And so the rules are set by community. And that community may not include every single stakeholder, but it includes a lot more than if I were at a private institution using one private donor's money to make my decisions. And so I think sort of public accountability for the decisions and mechanisms for having public discussions about how should we set up the infrastructure. So for instance, SOMAR has an advisory board, or we will, I'm still waiting to hear back.
So SOMAR is the social
media. The social media archive at ICPSR. We'll have an advisory board of folks that we've chosen in part because sometimes they disagree with me and I already know that, and sometimes because they have already wrestled with some of these questions about access. And we purposely built a group that can have hard discussions about decisions. And sometimes the answer might be, we're not going to do that. And I think we have to be open to that, which can be really hard as a researcher, especially with any level of engineering background, that you should always be like, no, I can build it. Be like, but you should not. And so I think that's one way to do it, and to sort of think about power is to distribute the decision-making and input. Another is to guarantee sort of rights to the individuals who are represented in the data. So things like rights to be forgotten are important. And as frustrating it is for me as a researcher for someone to say, please take me out of your study, that's still important because they are individuals and they do have agency and they have rights, and their rights create obligations for me. I think that a right to be forgotten is a different right than to be removed when deleted, like when you think about deleted data. So this is one of the especially tricky areas, is when people delete data from platforms. Should we delete them from our data sets? And I think the answer is it depends. That sometimes in order to do the science, we need the deleted information, and it doesn't actually carry much risk for the individuals for us to keep it. And how do we understand the difference between a deletion request and a request to be forgotten, where both of them ought to be rights that individuals have, but they create different obligations from the archive and from researchers. But I'm getting away from the so what do we do? Let me think, how else do we think about power? I mean, we try to build flexibility in. So part of building infrastructure is making decisions about how the infrastructure will function technically. And so there's some controls that we build into technical infrastructure, and there are some things that we build in through policy decisions. And it's important to recognize that the decisions that we're making politically now might change in the future. So we have to be careful about what do we build into the code itself, and what do we build in the future, so that we can make different decisions in the future without requiring a complete re-engineering of an infrastructure. So what does it, I'm trying to think of an example for instance, on ingest. So if we think about sensitive data coming into the archive, if we keep all of the identifiers and all of the sensitivity when the data comes into the archive, and then we set rules about when is that sensitive data made available to others, that we allow ourselves to let people say, you can use my data after I'm dead. But if we destroy the connection between that person and their data when we bring the data in, we cannot honor that request either. So that's a case where there's a technical decision and a policy decision, and that they need to line up, but they don't need to be the same at the same moment.
Yes.
And so those are some other ways that we build it in, is sort of we think about how would someone make a different decision, and how do I support the exercise of that decision in the infrastructure that we create, which is a much harder problem to figure out how to build around than I realized when we started this project.
Fascinating. A reminder to folks that in the audience that you can use the Q&A feature at any time if you have questions that you want to add. Libby, I want to shift a little bit to put on your researcher hat. We've been talking quite a bit from your archivist hat. And so within your own research, how do you incorporate reflections on power and justice within your research methods? What does that look like for you as a researcher?
Sure. So the first way was that I sidestepped it. So when I first came to studying social media data, this was in maybe 2010. I'm trying to think if my kid was born yet or not, but I'm queer and I'm married, and I had to get married a lot of times. And the New York legislature was deciding whether they would be the first to legislate a right to same-sex marriage. And at the time I had these sort of columns. You remember TweetDeck? I don't know if this is even still a thing, but I had TweetDeck, and I had my timeline, like my friends, and then I had politicians, and then I had celebrities, because I love politics and I love celebrity. And that it was a Friday afternoon in the summertime, and the New York legislator is debating this, and I'm like, oh, I really love it when legislators debate my rights. And the politicians column was like, see me on Sunday morning as I talk about, I don't know, completely unrelated topic, right? It's like, as I talk about healthcare policy or immigration or something. I guess those are not unrelated, but they're not marriage equality. And the column where I studied celebrities, or where I watched celebrities, was like, oh my gosh, did you guys see what's happening in New York? Like, look at what's going on. I was like, wait, why are the politicians talking about TV and the TV stars are talking about politics? Like, what is going on? And that's how I got started in social media research, was that Friday afternoon being like, wait a minute, are these timelines reversed? And then I was like, okay, I want to understand why this is happening. And I started to look into, just not even systematically, just like clicking through sort of who else was involved in these conversations, and what types of things were people talking about. And I found that individual users who I didn't know were exposing a lot of their sort of personal trauma and personal information in those discussions with celebrities. And I thought, I better stay away from that, because I don't know what to do about how they're just putting that out there on the internet. But over in the politics side, it was easy for me to see how it was okay for me to use public statements by elected officials without having to worry about them saying things that they shouldn't have said. Like, that's just, turns out, if you're a publicly elected, or if you're a public official and you've been elected and you say something, people are going to remember it. And so I just sidestepped all of these ethical issues that we've just been talking about. And I was like, nope.
So I don't think that's a sidestep. I think that's studying up, right? So back to our ethnographic analogy, one thing that ethnographers have done to grapple with the ethics of what they do, which comes from a legacy of colonialism and all kinds of other like nasty backgrounds, is that they started studying people in power to whom we expect accountability, right?
Yeah.
And
that's
that's
that's awesome.
and that's what you did. You did
like,
the
I
side
study
step.
up.
You studied up.
It's like I don't punch down, I only study up.
That's right.
So basically,
I think that's awesome. I think, and that's absolutely like one really good way to deal with power and power relationships. Study people more powerful than you.
yeah. And they're not just, because I think that there are some limits to studying up also.
Yes.
But I think when you're an elected official, it's a little bit different. Because like figuring, as we've watched Twitter try to figure out what constitutes a public figure, I don't want to be part of that mess either. Like, I think we can all agree that if people voted for you and you take federal dollars, that you are a public official. So
bright line.
I got very narrow, and I was like, was this person elected by a majority of their constituents? Then yes, they go in my data set. So yeah, but I'm gonna write this down because makes a lot of sense.
So that's been sort of one major way, is studying up. Other sort of reflections on awareness or on power as your research has evolved over time.
Yeah, I think when I think about so now I study political extremists, in part because politicians got really boring. And then, I mean, think about when you get a postcard in the mail. If you live in the US, even if you're not a registered voter, you get these postcards. You can't tell anything about a person. Like, they're just like, vote for me, I care about, and then they tell, and you're like, I understand these words, but they're not different from the words on your opponent's postcard. And that's how they sort of got in social media until 2016. You might remember politics went a little topsy-turvy in the US in 2016, and that was true online as well. And then I was like, wait a minute, are these political extremists or are they Republicans? And I had the same 2-column problem that I had before, where I couldn't tell politicians and celebrities apart. I couldn't tell the right and the alt-right apart. I was like, what is going on there? And so I went systematically to look for the differences. And I did not find as many as I was hoping to find. But then what did I do there? So in order to use those, I started to do a lot of aggregation. So like I said earlier, even though I study white supremacy, I'm not out to shame individual white supremacists or even to expose them, but I want to understand, how does somebody get to that place? And what are the types of messages that they are sharing that put the rest of us in danger? And so I don't actually need to know about them as individuals to do that work. So again, this is sort of picking a research question and some data that allow me to avoid putting individuals at risk. And when I do that, so I wrote a report for the Anti-Defamation League that came out on January 6th about extremism and the types of white supremacy that platforms miss in their automated moderation. And we had a lot of conversations where me and one of my students and people at the ADL, to talk about which quotes were appropriate. And we tried to quote only institutional figures and to quote people who had, or user accounts who had long records of the types of speech that we were talking about. So we didn't put anybody in the report by name who had a one-off comment. And so we were looking at sort of patterns of behavior, and we wanted to provide examples, but we didn't want to, create a woke mob coming after folks in our examples. And so sort of aggregating the data to look for patterns, and then being really careful about which quotes we put in.
Which you choose as sort of the exemplars of the pattern. Yeah.
Yep.
That's really.
So that's another way that sort of thinking about, and again, I think that's sort of like studying up when you're looking at institutions rather than individuals. The institutions have more power. I think to come back to the tension between being an archivist and being a researcher, I have different types of power in those two different roles as well. So one of them that is especially useful to me is that as an individual researcher, my responsibilities toward a platform's terms of service are very different than my posture towards terms of service as an archivist. And I'm willing as an archivist to violate the terms of service when it's better for science and society. It's hard to figure out when that is, but I'm willing to do it. But as an individual researcher, it's much more dangerous for me to do that. And I would not ask my PhD students to do it, because that carries a different set of individual risks. But terms of service are designed to protect platforms. They're not designed to protect users, and they're not designed to facilitate science. And so when do I have to follow them and under what conditions depends in part on which institutional role am I occupying when I fight with the terms of service.
Yeah, oh, that's really interesting. Can you talk, this leads me kind of into a resource question. And this might be, you can answer it with either hat on, or maybe both, but it's probably an institutional question. I'm not totally sure. What resources would make addressing power and justice concerns in data archiving easier? What resources should exist or could exist to help?
I mean, money first, but what does the money buy you? So the money buys you the time and effort of people who have been excluded from the conversation because they couldn't volunteer. So that's one. And also money buys you compute for people who don't have access to compute at their institutions. And I think that if we bring more people to the table than we have been able to, and we give them the tools to do the work that they want to do, that we will solve a lot of the problems that the existing power structures have created.
That's awesome. How do you talk to your students, putting your researcher hat back on, about power, ethics, and social media data? How do you guide them? What do you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, I try to be really transparent about my own decision-making processes. So for instance, my story about the politicians and the celebrities is one that I have told most of my students. I bring them, so even though my students were not involved in my ADL project or in the writing of that report, when ADL and I were having conversations about what to put in the final report, I brought my students in. I said, hey, you should sit in on this conversation because like I want your input and I want you to see how I make these choices. I think that another way that I do it is by talking to my students about issues of power and access in all the work that we do. And it's not, like those things don't matter just when we're trying to write a paper or using social media data. They matter in how we choose classes and how we decide when and where we will meet. They matter when we recruit students to join the lab. They matter when sort of who gets a GSRA that's grant funded versus a GSI position that's institutionally funded. And that by normalizing these conversations where we are explicit about what is the power relationship that is constraining people's choices in this moment, then it's easier to have those conversations when we think about what power are we using or exercising or missing when we do research, and sort of who are we putting at risk and who are we asking to make sacrifice. And so I think it can't just be part of a methodological discussion. It's got to be a posture towards the work.
Yeah. And that it's a muscle that you need to practice using in order to sort of flex it when you're doing research, right? Like it's, yes, having those conversations all the time about everything that's going on. I think it's really, really, really useful to sort of training up the ability to say, wait a second, I think there's something going on here.
Yep. Especially when I mentioned earlier that one of the benefits of money is that it can bring people to the table who couldn't volunteer. That one of the benefits of transparency is that it includes people who don't already have all of this sort of hidden knowledge that it takes to be successful in academia. That if we just assume that everyone needs to talk about it, then we don't ostracize anybody who didn't already know. And we don't privilege folks who already sort of knew the unwritten rules or the hidden agenda or whatever. That if we just acknowledge as a group that we're always going to have these discussions, then we get to sort of bring along the folks who didn't already know it, and we force those who had sort of shortcuts to think about what was the shortcut that they took, like who made these decisions already that they were taking for granted, and would we make different ones if we were going to make them ourselves.
What's coming down the pipe in the social media data ethics horizon? What haven't we talked about today, but we should? What should we be paying attention to?
Oh, I think so. There are a couple of projects that are opt-in that I think will be really interesting. So we started out our conversation talking about, or maybe it was like the second question, how would we do public education around social media data and its use in research? And I think there are a couple of projects that are starting to do opt-in where people can deposit their data. So you can deposit your data at the social media archive if you want to. There's a project at Northeastern that's trying to do that as well. And then maybe one at, I think, well, I can't remember the other institution, so I'm sorry that I can't acknowledge them, but it'll be interesting to see how messaging and infrastructure around those projects gets built. So those are moments where we have to start to actually have the conversations of like, oh, that I said earlier, like, yeah, we should have a public conversation about this. Like, there is federal money going into projects that do this. And so we all have a stake in saying, like, how should this work? What is the difference between being deleted and being forgotten? When I opt in, am I opting into all potential uses of my data or only some? Can I give you just part of my archive, but not the whole thing? That I think those will be pretty interesting in the sort of immediate horizon in the next couple of years. How do we sort of teach people how to take care of their data? I think that digital privacy and the sort of how do we understand privacy and surveillance are actually fundamental to figuring out what are the ethics around social media data management. So one of the challenges, right, I said, like, let's give people power of their data. Does anybody remember what happened when Facebook rolled out their first set of privacy settings? Like, we didn't know what the hell to do as users. And so it's one thing to say, give people power, and it's another to teach them how to use it and how to sort of leverage that power. So thinking about now that the idea of digital privacy is sort of in the public conversation, what does that start to mean? And what do you sort of, how do we as society start to think about what ought to be private and what ought to be public and what ought to be, I decide when, I decide who, et cetera. And I think that these are connected to issues of surveillance and consent and these other sort of larger sort of, I don't know, social issues that we like to think we're divorced from, but really are central to our work. And one example I would give, I mean, I'm going to expose my politics, but that's not a big surprise. I did say I couldn't always tell the difference between the right and alt-right. Where is it? So Ron Wyden is a senator from Oregon, and he had an op-ed in Slate about the connection between abortion rights and digital privacy. And I think that that gives a good example of sort of how do we think that digital privacy is just about digital privacy when really it's about surveillance and sort of being hunted, not just surveilled, but hunted. And we could listen to people like Ruha Benjamin, who tell us that surveillance has been a really big problem for Black folks for a long time. And if we just listened, we would understand how to avoid surveillance structures that do harm when we tried to pitch them as social goods. So I think sort of watching how we learn from people we've been ignoring will be interesting, and what are the intersections of consent and privacy and power and access in the next couple of years.
Fantastic. I have learned so much from this conversation. This was really fun. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any last things you want to make sure get said?
I don't know. I mean, I guess if you're a researcher, until we build these sort of social mechanisms, just please think about what are the risks and benefits that are happening in your research. And that I will have tremendous respect for you if you come to the decision to not do the project. Like, there is not actually shame in that. There should be pride in saying that's probably not worth it. So I think that would be my takeaway.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank
Sure.
you for this. We will sign off.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Libby. Take care.